Hello together, this is Alexander Schacht. I'm the chair of the PSI PSI Special Interest Group on Benefit Risk. Welcome to this webinar with Eva Katz from Janssen, who will speak about measuring patient and physician benefit risk preferences in antipsychotic clinical trials. Before we go into her introduction, I just want to make a couple of logistical notes. Any question and answers, please type them into the chat box that is there on the system, on the GoToWebinar system, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. There's also some announcement in terms of some upcoming webinars. So this special interest group will also have a webinar with a presenter from Evidera, Kevin Marsh, in about 4 weeks. Currently, we have some difficulties in terms of registering for that. But please watch out. We'll hope to get that fixed very soon so that you can register in time for this webinar. We'll also send further updates in terms of that. In terms of updates, if you haven't done already, please subscribe to the email list on www.benefitriskassessment.com, where you also found the registration link to this webinar. Because then you will get updates on the monthly updates on what's happening in this field, as well as you'll be the first to learn about any new activities, any follow-up webinars, things like this. There's also some other webinars coming up for other topics. One that I would like to especially highlight is the causal inference webinars that Muna Kacha from Novartis is organizing, and that is taking place on November 2nd. Please check out the PSI homepage for that. Another topic is tomorrow there's actually a one-day meeting on estimates taking place. Please check out also the PSI homepage regarding this if you if you're very spontaneous and want to go there. And finally, we'll also have topics around benefit risk and some other, of course, very, very relevant topics at the PSI conference next year in Amsterdam. Very nice city, very nice timing at the beginning of June. The call for abstracts is out and the deadline is 24th of November, so you still have a little bit of time to submit any work. If there's, we hope that we also get some more contributed presentations in terms of benefit risk, so that we maybe bundle them together in a special benefit risk session. So that's in terms of some announcement at the beginning. Now I'm very, very glad to introduce Eva Katz to you. She's the Associate Director of the Benefit Risk and Epidemiological team at Janssen Research and Development. She serves as an internal consultant regarding benefit risk methodology and helps to put more patient-focused into this benefit risk assessment. She guides clinical teams across various therapeutic areas, and today we'll focus on her case study in antipsychotic clinical trials. What makes it really interesting is that she's working both on qualitative and quantitative methods, and how to integrate that into clinical trials. So today we'll learn a lot about how we can actually do things together in one clinical trial instead of maybe getting these things from different parts of the program. Prior to Eva's role in benefit risk, She was part of the patient-reported outcomes team and worked on these outcomes in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, also across various therapeutic areas. Of mention is that she has been to quite some different institutions, from the Rutgers University to University of California in Berkeley, as well as the Jillings School of Public Health in North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And with this introduction, I'm opening up now the stage for Eva to give a presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Alexander, and thanks to everyone for joining. So before I get started, I just also want to acknowledge all of the co-authors and contributors on the work. There's been several people who have contributed. So I'll start out with an overview and motivation for the project, and then talk about the preference surveys, the design, the results, and the application. So schizophrenia is a debilitating brain disorder, and although the cause is unknown, there's thought to be an interplay with both biological and environmental factors. The prevalence in the US is estimated to be around 1% and about 0.5% worldwide. Onset of schizophrenia typically occurs in late adolescence or early adulthood, although it can occur at any age. And the signs and symptoms vary with each individual, but are typically characterized as positive and negative, as well as cognitive. So the positive symptoms typically refer to the delusions, hallucinations, agitated body movements. Negative symptoms are associated with flat affect, reduced speech, and withdrawal. And the cognitive symptoms are the disorganized thinking and difficulty with instructions. So these signs and symptoms wax and wane throughout the patient's lifetime. And as you can imagine, they impair personal, social, and occupational functioning. And, you know, although there's no cure for schizophrenia, there are various treatment options, medication, psychotherapy, as well as community support. Many of the medicines have side effects, and the most common side effects are weight gain, hyperglycemia, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, extrapyramidal symptoms, and prolactin elevation. So one issue that is associated with schizophrenia treatment is the low treatment adherence. Non-adherence is estimated to be approximately 50%. And there's been reports as high as 75 to 90%. And the reason why this is such an issue is that medication gaps of just a few days can have, a large impact on relapse risk. So I just want to pause as well. So I know that we're not. Everyone's muted on the line, but if you do have questions throughout, please type them in the chat box. So I just want to provide why did we do this preference survey? What is the rationale behind it? There are existing oral and 1-month long-acting injectable treatments for schizophrenia, and Janssen was starting a new clinical program to develop a 3-month long-acting injectable formulation. So were there questions with this longer-acting injectable that potentially there could be differences in efficacy or safety compared to the oral or 1-month injectable? So we decided that a preference survey could then provide data on the patient's and physician's value of those key benefits and harms, as well as choice of formulation. So in addition to that clinical data, we could have the values from a physician perspective and a patient perspective on those clinical endpoints. So we designed a conjoint analysis discrete choice experiment study. We had 2 surveys, a physician survey and a patient survey, and we embedded those within 2 of the phase 3 clinical trials. I also want to mention that these surveys had analogous sets of attributes, and it was the language was adapted for each group. So just to get into, how did we decide upon selecting the attributes? There was an initial list of 35 potential benefits and risks, and that came about from the literature and product inserts, as well as discussion with key opinion leaders. There was follow-up with telephone interviews, and from that, 7 attributes were identified that were most characteristics of schizophrenia benefits and harms, and they were viewed as the most critical attributes. So the list of attributes that we included in the preference survey are 3 benefits and 4 harms. So on the benefit side, we have improvement in positive symptoms, improvement in negative symptoms, and improvement in social functioning. And on the harm side, we have weight gain, extrapyramidal symptoms, hyperprolactinemia, and hyperglycemia. So I'm going to jump into the results and then talk about the development of the survey. So these are the results from the physician survey. So this is the mean relative importance for each of those treatment attributes that we included in the survey. And all importance weights were scaled to 10, and the results were from a random parameters logit model. So we see that positive symptoms was the most important attribute to physicians. So total improvement in positive symptoms for the level studies was viewed as the most important, and all other endpoints were scaled based on that. So social functioning was the second most important endpoint from a physician perspective, and it was viewed as about 3/4 as important as a total improvement in positive symptoms, followed by improvement in negative symptoms. And you can see that even minimal improvement in positive symptoms was more important than any of the harms or side effects included in the study. So the hyperglycemia, the EPS, the weight gain, or the hyperprolactinemia. So from a patient perspective, we also found that patients viewed that total improvement in positive symptoms as the most important attribute assessed. And even minimal improvement in positive symptoms was more important than any other efficacy or side effect that was included in the survey. And there were 211 patients that were included in this preference survey. Okay, so we also included a second set of choice questions within the preference survey. And the intention was that we wanted to assess how adherence and choice of formulation would impact preferences. So the bars that you see on the left were showing based on patient adherence. So we have adherence in blue, a patient who skips about 20% of doses in red, and patients who skip half of their doses in green. So you can see from a physician perspective, they view it's more important to switch a less adherent patient from an oral to a 3-month injectable. We also assessed efficacy within those same choice questions, so an improvement in positive symptoms. So from that, we can make a comparison and compare switching from an oral to 3-month injectable to improvement in positive symptoms. And from this, you can see that physicians regard switching a non-adherent patient from an oral to an injectable similar to a 25% improvement in efficacy. And this data enables us to make a strong benefit risk case, even if that 3-month long-acting injectable that was being developed had less efficacy than the oral formulation. And we assessed a similar trade-off from the patient perspective. So, I've started off by showing the results, and now I'm just going to touch upon the development of the preference survey. and the key elements that typically go into the development. So the structure of the survey, selecting and defining the attributes, developing the vignette, pre-testing the survey, and then some tests for consistency and face validity that were included. So the preference survey had 4 parts to it. It started off with background questions, and then had a training portion where we defined each of the attributes being assessed and levels, and then also included warm-up questions to orient respondents to these types of surveys. There were 8 of the benefit-harm trade-off tasks and 4 of those formulation trade-off tasks included within the survey. And the survey took approximately 20 minutes to complete. So, in defining the attributes, it's very important to level set so that there's understanding of the endpoints and there's detailed definitions that correspond. This helps to provide a consistent understanding of the endpoints and also allowed us to align the definitions and attributes with the clinical trial endpoints. So this is an example of the different levels the different languages that were included in the attribute definition. So this is an example for the attribute improvement in positive symptoms. And this is the physician definition. So we had 4 levels: no significant improvement, minimally improved, much improved, and very much improved. So for each level, we also had a % reduction in positive symptoms associated with it. So you'll see no significant improvement had less than 10%, minimally improved had that 25% reduction, much improved had a 50% reduction in symptoms, and very much improved 80%. And for all of the levels that were associated with improvement, we also had example symptoms described that a physician would see in a patient at this level. So how did we even come up with these levels and textual descriptions? So it came from the literature because we wanted to link the clinical trial endpoints to the preference data. So we found information that showed some of the clinical assessments. So the Clinical Global Impression Improvement Scale, which is a 7-point scale and includes levels of improvement listed here for associated with each of the 7 points. And there's a publication that did a crosswalk with the PANS. And from that, we were able to develop these % reduction levels associated with levels of schizophrenia symptoms. So a 10% reduction, the 25% reduction, 50% reduction, and 80% reduction. So what was shown in the definition for the physician survey. We also, in terms of the textual descriptions, that was also from the literature in terms of looking at the PANS scores and selecting descriptions of symptoms based on PANS items that had the largest loading on the positive factor score, so from a factor analysis. So this is an example of the description of positive symptoms for patients. And the language here, again, is from the PANS scale, and using some of the textual description directly from it based on the factor analysis. So this would allow us to link those levels to the PANS scale. Okay. So the harm attributes, we also define them separately for physicians and patients, with physicians having a % or yes, no, and with the patients, it was more descriptive of what that attribute and level would manifest as. Okay. So also important within a preference study is the vignette, as it sets the frame for the decision and limits the degree to which respondents make assumptions in their decisions. So the vignette for the physician survey, we asked physicians to make a choice as if they were considering a 40-year-old patient with a 20-year history of treated schizophrenia who'd just been released to their care from a hospital. They'd been previously stable on their antipsychotic medication, but they were brought to the hospital when they had an acute exacerbation in symptoms. The patient was experiencing both severe positive, the hallucinations, delusions, and negative symptoms, the emotional withdrawal and blunted affect. They no longer appear to respond to their current medication and need a new treatment. They had no other comorbidities. So the physician would make their choice task based on this framing within the vignette. So this is an example of the choice task for the physician survey. So you see on the leftmost column, we have symptoms that a patient would have within a typical week, and these are the benefits, the efficacy attributes, the improvement in positive symptoms, improvement in negative symptoms, and social functioning. And then at the bottom, we have the side effects within the first year, the weight gain, EPS, hyperprolactinemia, and hyperglycemia. And the physician is making the decision which outcome is better for the patient based on the vignette that we provided. So from the patient for the patient preference survey, the vignette was geared towards the patient, but we also asked the patient to make a decision for another patient. So we had them consider a treatment for another person diagnosed with schizophrenia, whose name was Pat. And Pat was this 40-year-old who had been treated for schizophrenia for 20 years. They lived with their sister and had a good relationship with their doctor and no other health problems. Pat's doctor could prescribe one of two possible medications for him. And we asked the respondent to make that decision the choice task based on for another patient. So which medicine is better for Pat? And again, we included the 7 attributes, the 3 efficacy and 4 harms, but it was more textual for within the patient survey. So next, the respondents would see the formulation trade-off task. So again, this is an example from the physician survey, and we asked the physician to make a decision for a patient, again, that same patient, assuming that that patient takes their medication as prescribed with full adherence. And then there was a follow-up question that assumed different degrees of adherence. And in that, we limited the efficacy and safety endpoints included. We included 1 efficacy, improvement in positive symptoms, and 1 harm, EPS. And we asked that they assume all other outcomes are the same for each medication. So this is an example from the physician formulation trade-off task. So again, they're making a decision, the physician is making a decision which treatment is better for the patient, medication A or B. And we've included mode of administration. So here, medication A is a pill once a day, and medication B is an injection once every 3 months. We've included the efficacy attribute of improvement in positive symptoms and the harm of EPS. And these are probabilities, so we've shown it graphically as well as a count and a percentage. So the physician would make a decision as which treatment would be better for the patient. And if they selected the pill, we would have a follow-up question providing new information showing the adherence. And so here the new information shows that the patient missed or skipped approximately 20% of their doses of oral medicine. And then we ask the physician to make another decision as which treatment is better for the patient. So in this example, the physician then selected the injectable given the non-adherence. So with this survey, we did pre-testing of all of the survey questions, and there was open interviews with 24 psychiatrists and 12 patients to test the clarity, confirm the appropriateness of the attributes and levels, and to assess the willingness to accept trade-off among these treatment attributes. During the pretest, we did make some slight refinements to the attributes and wording. And the examples I showed you were the final versions that were included within the survey. So we integrated the preference surveys within 2 of the antipsychotic phase 3 clinical trials, and this was for that 3-month long-acting injectable. So the surveys were protocol requirements, and the survey was only available in English. We didn't translate it. So for the patient survey, we implemented it at English-speaking sites only in the US, Canada, and Australia. We did have ePro implemented within those studies, so we were able to implement the preference survey on a tablet computer during the site visit. Because we wanted to allow patients time to have experience with long-acting injectables, we assessed preferences at week 12 to 17. So it was a one-time survey, but we did it at a time point that would give patients the opportunity to experience long-acting injectable and to be stabilized on the long-acting injectable. So for this physician survey, again, the survey was in English. Because most investigators globally did speak English or and read and write English, we opened up the survey to all physicians who participated within the clinical trial. Physicians were emailed an invitation to participate in the survey, and they could then take the survey on any computer at their leisure. And again, we wanted physicians to have the opportunity to have experience with patients who had used long-acting injectables. So we invited the physicians to complete the survey approximately 3 to 4 months after enrolling patients. We developed various tests for internal consistency and face validity. We developed a SAP and included these criteria within the SAP. We wanted to make sure that respondents were attentive, so we would exclude subjects who responded all A's or B's to all of the choice tasks. If they took too short of a time to complete the survey, we also eliminated the responses from the analysis. So for this survey that was supposed to take 20 minutes, we had used the criteria of requiring 7 minutes or more to complete the survey. We also examined questions where there was repeated questions or, where we expected them to be identical or very similar. Also evaluated a rank ordering of levels. You expect that better outcomes should have higher preferences compared to lower, less preferred outcomes. So for example, with high levels of positive symptoms, you would expect that that would not be preferred compared to low levels of positive symptoms. So we did these checks with the analyses. So the preference survey, we used it in health authority discussions. And, we had feedback from the EMA stating that, they were interested in seeing the preference data and that they would consider it supportive of the benefit risk analyses. We also summarized the preference information and included it within the regulatory submission, included it within the clinical overview. And it helped inform the benefit risk assessment. So we also completed benefit risk assessment using the clinical trial data. From the survey, it demonstrated the importance of formulation. Physicians and patients both preferred the long-acting injectable over the oral formulations, and both physicians and patients had the strongest preference for improvement in positive symptoms. It also demonstrated the ability, for stable schizophrenia patients to perform conjoint surveys. So we've published the results of the clinical trial work, and I've included the citation above. And also the survey had been piloted previously in panel populations, and that has been published as well. We're currently working on a manuscript to compare the results from the panels and the clinical trial population, as well as a publication describing implementation of a preference survey within a clinical trial. So that is my last slide, and I'm happy to open it up to questions and comments.
Okay, thanks a lot for this very nice presentation. So any questions, please come up now or type them into the chat box that is on the screen. If you have any problems with that, please speak up. Otherwise, first, thanks a lot again for the presentations. These citations are, or at least the first two, are also on the on our homepage, so you can find them there. I have a couple of questions regarding that, and especially regarding your last points. So you had upfront discussions with both EMA and FDA on these kind of topics, and how was that interaction? So give they any kind of advice on how you would run the study, so how you would collect patient preferences and things like this?
So it was with the EMA, and there was a planned discussion for other topics. So in that, though, we included information on the preference survey, and that's where they had said that they would accept the preference information, but view it as supportive, and not necessarily making decisions based solely on the preference work.
Yeah, I think that is quite understandable, given that it's more and more going into this, but it's great to see that one side actually makes a first move in terms of presenting this data and submitting this data. Did they make any comments on the study design in terms of collecting or elicitation their preference? Did they mention anything like, yeah, conjoint analysis is a very good way to go?
No, there was no additional feedback on the design of the surveys. It was just very high level. Okay,
very good. Did you have any interactions with any HTA bodies regarding this already? Do you know about that?
No, I know there was interest internally, but I don't think that I'm not sure if they shared the information or data.
Okay, there could be some background noise, so if someone is not speaking, please mute your phone. In terms of, yeah, so conjoint analysis, for example, is one of the two methods that the German HTA body, the IQWiG, looked into and assessed it and reviewed it next to AHP. And I think there's there's at least some discussions regarding this, whether they are actually supportive of it or not supportive is a matter of debate, actually. In terms of your company internal discussions to go into this, what were kind of the hurdles on one hand and facilitators on the other hand to come up with such an approach to show how such a patient preference survey can help in this setting?
I think we've had very favorable interactions with the clinicians, at least within neuroscience, and they were very eager, to implement the preference survey within the clinical trial. And so we really didn't have many hurdles. I think the hurdles were mostly operational because it was so new. So just figuring out how to actually do it and implement it. but we did get a lot of support internally.
Okay, very good, great. Now we have the first questions from the audience, and the first one I had on my list as well. Did you analyze any patient subgroups? So did it, for example, matter whether patients were already, experiencing weight gains, or whether, whether that could be gender-specific topics? And I know weight gain is probably one of the bigger problems, because we are not talking just about gaining of 1 or 2 kilos, but some of these patients on these antipsychotics actually double their weight. So
yeah.
What did you do anything regarding this?
Yeah, we actually did. We did pre-specify subgroups that we wanted to explore in our statistical analysis plan, and we did test for heterogeneity, but we didn't detect it within our sample.
Okay. And were these questions compulsory for the patients to respond to, or was that was there some kind of opt-out included in the protocol?
So it was a protocol requirement. So we did require it for the English-speaking regions. So the opt-out would be if a patient wasn't stable. We asked, to ensure that a patient was stable. And we did build in that there were different visits that a patient could take the assessment as well, but we did include it as a protocol requirement.
Okay, thanks a lot. There's one other question regarding those patients where you had inconsistency in the preference elicitation. Did you include them completely, or did you do any sensitivity analysis in that regard?
So we did explore the data. We wound up excluding patients only if they selected all A's or B's. So there really wasn't much inconsistency. It was really subjects who seemed not to pay attention to the survey. And we also did allow for 1 retest for patients. So if they took too short of a test time or did respond all A's or B's on the first try, we would allow them to have 1 retest. But that was the main reason for exclusion.
Okay, thanks a lot. One other question is about generalizability of these topics. So the patients that we recruit for clinical trials are sometimes very special patients. Do you have any data on how that would generalize to patients that would be recruited in that you would see more in general practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a limitation of implementing within the clinical trials, because you do have patients who potentially have a different risk tolerance participating in clinical trials, or who might be more open to, in this case, long-acting injectables. So I think that is a limitation. We did also pilot the preference surveys in a panel population, so we do have that data. There are a lot of similarities between the responses, but I think generalizability is an issue.
Yeah, I think, and especially in a patient population of where you have, really severely affected patients actually cannot complete the survey, I guess.
Right.
So that, I think, is another topic. Sometimes in other areas, so for example, in Alzheimer, people would also consider to use other, so for example, relatives or spouses to do the preference elicitation. Have you thought about that as well?
We didn't for this particular study, but we've considered it for other studies to use, a caregiver or somebody else, and that could be important. You might get different preferences, or it could be a good proxy potentially.
Yeah, yeah. I think that is that is also kind of related to the subgroup question. So patients with that have different levels of symptoms at the time they fill in the questionnaire, the survey, if they are stable, if the survey results are stable across the range of different severities, then I think that would, for example, point into the direction that it's more generalizable. So also if you have within your clinical trial across all the different patients rather stable preferences, that I think also a way to assume that, well, if then within this clinical trial situation there's very small variabilities, then beyond it, then might also not be that much. One question is about missing values. So here missing values is, I think, a completely different topic than if you want to compare treatments. It has a very different understanding of missing topics, whether there's maybe probably it's also related to generalizability. But do you know of any kind of methods to handle missing data in such a cross-sectional survey?
I know that we did include within our analysis, respondents had to answer at least one choice question. So we did include results from subjects who didn't respond to all of the choice tasks, but I'm not sure if they're referring to other types of missing values.
Okay. One additional question more in terms of the logistics. How long did the kind of complete process last from the first activities up to having everything set up so that you can include it in your clinical trial? So how much of a pre-work time would you think people need in order to get that into a clinical trial?
Yeah, it does take quite a bit of time, and I think there's also a learning curve with the first time that you do it. I would say when you're early on in planning the phase, if it's a phase 3 trial or phase 2 trial, you want to give yourself plenty of time because you need to allow time to develop the survey. And in this case, we developed and tested it in a panel population before we implemented it within the clinical trial. But you can just allow 6 to 9 months prior for that development, plus all of allowing time for the operational hurdles in terms of implementing it within the clinical trial. I would say you want to give yourself at least a year prior to embedding within the trial.
Okay, very good. So based on your experience with this, would you recommend that there is more closer collaboration with the regulators? So for example, in terms of having them agree into the selection of the attributes before conducting the study? Would you think that would help with the weight that you can put on the study as a submission?
Yeah, I think if there is opportunity to collaborate with regulators early on, I think it can be very helpful. I know we were trying that for a program that actually didn't move forward, but I think that's a great opportunity, and it seems like there's interest from the FDA potentially to meet with sponsors when they're developing preference surveys to include it within discussions.
Yeah, I think there's this very famous preference topic in the non-pharma or non-medication area, where it's about operations and about weight decrease, where there was a lot of discussions about that with the FDA. And there's another big topics about Duchenne's disease, where there's quite some discussions with the FDA on that topic. Did you have any interactions with patient advocacy groups prior to that?
So for this particular study, I didn't, but it's not to say that, you know, I didn't come on at the start of the panel. So potentially there might have been discussions when the panel surveys were developed. And so I'm not certain, but we have for other studies, you know, involved advocacy groups, and we, you know, it's great to get that additional perspective as well, and potentially, you know, there are other opportunities for collaboration with the advocacy groups.
Do you think this this kind of survey and these results could be used beyond your specific clinical trial program? So whether that could be, you know, more kind of a schizophrenia specific outcome rather than something that you only can use in your phase 3 program?
I think it can be. I think we did see, you know, consistencies between the survey within the clinical trial and then, you know, when we implemented it in the panel. So I think that shows that there's some more broader application beyond just the clinical trial population, but really that relates to schizophrenia patients in general.
Yeah, I think it would be really great for, especially for certain areas where there's lots of different studies going on, if there would be some kind of general patient preferences that you can use across different sponsors and across different companies, then you would only kind of need to adjust it for certain special situations. So for example, if there's only a certain special benefit for your program and you need to anchor that with all the other things that is already there, or certain side effects that's happening. Mm-hmm. In terms of side effects, so there were other antipsychotics where the long-acting injection led to some very rare but also very severe side effects, where people were basically falling asleep at within a couple of hours after the injection. And of course, you know, that so they were probably overdosed, and the long-acting formulation didn't work. Probably. So if you have, and you can't plan for that in your survey because you only know about that after you have seen the phase 3 results, or you only get aware about that during safety reviews during the phase 3 program. Mm-hmm. How can you plan for these kind of unforeseen side effects?
Mm-hmm. I guess you can't. I mean, from a preference survey standpoint, you know, potentially if there are methods where the survey is more flexible and potentially you could then integrate, you know, an additional attribute after the survey's been developed somehow. I mean, that potentially could be a method for assessing, for including it within the survey for endpoints that, you know, you become aware of later on. But with this typical development of the DCE, I don't think this methodology would allow for that.
Yeah, that's actually one of my other questions I had. So the DCE is one approach. but there's also a couple of other approaches like swing rates and these kind of things. So why did you select the conjoint analysis here?
So the methodology was selected prior to me joining the project, but so I'm not sure why that methodology was selected over others, but I think primarily it was due to the information that we wanted to get, just in terms of, including getting the preferences for the benefits and harms, and also including the formulation tasks. So I think the methodology worked well for that.
Yeah, I think what's very nice approach about this approach is it's very easy to explain. So you just need to say, okay, this is my preference over this. Did you always have just this is my preference over this, or did you also include kind of don't know option?
For this one, we didn't include the don't know option. We just, had them do the two. They had to select between the two options.
Okay. There's another question here from the audience. Is that patient preference study kind of seen as a great example within Janssen, so triggering further similar studies in other therapeutic areas?
So we are doing quite a few patient preference study and have been asked to do more probably than we're able to. But there are teams that are very open to including it within the clinical trial. But really there are many factors that might go into the decision as to whether to include the preference survey within the clinical trial versus including a panel. But I think overall, most of the clinical teams do value the information that we can get from a preference survey and are interested in capturing the data. But
could you speak a little bit to what kind of criteria that are, whether you are included directly within the clinical trial or whether you conduct a separate study for it?
Yeah, so I think some of the criteria might be if, it's difficult potentially to identify this population outside of the trial. So if you need a confirmed diagnosis and it's hard for patients to self-identify a diagnosis, that could be one rationale for including it within the trial. Also, if you're testing medications that might have some unique attribute that it's believed that patients should have experience with it prior to completing the preference survey, as opposed to just a hypothetical description. That's another rationale for including it within the survey. Some programs potentially, we've gotten feedback that because the surveys are very hypothetical in nature and can show risks that are more severe than anything that would be experienced within a clinical program, they potentially feel that it's better to use a panel population rather than embed it within the clinical trial. So I think there are several reasons for making a decision one way or another, and that's why we're hoping to publish some of our experiences in making those decisions, in a separate manuscript.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to that. So you have just spoken to a couple of benefits of including it in clinical trials. Did you see any specific hurdles for which would kind of point you to not include it in a clinical trial, but do a separate survey on it?
Yeah, I think it tends to be very costly and very time consuming, and there really are a lot of operational aspects that it is more time intensive than doing it within a panel. For example, with a physician survey, for the PP3M physicians, we had to find out which physicians to invite, send them emails, do follow up. And at first, even the physicians thought that potentially it was a marketing survey and they didn't want to complete it. So, we also had to have a letter from the clinical program leader to encourage them to take the survey and have, provide more education on the rationale for the survey, and just the follow-up, because, we needed to capture the email addresses. Email addresses can be incorrect. So there are a lot of operational tasks, and then things that you might not even think of that come up and just seem to make it more time intensive than you originally anticipated. So I think typically it's much easier to use a panel population, but sometimes there are benefits for including it within the clinical trial, where that might be the better choice.
Yeah, I think of course within a clinical trial you also have all the baseline information, you have pre-treatment, all these, and it's very, very well documented. Mm-hmm. So and you have the severity assessment from the physicians, which you might not have in a panel. So the data package surrounding the survey, I think, is much richer in a clinical trial than can ever be in a panel.
Right. Exactly. That's another benefit. You can link to all of the clinical trial data. Potentially, you can also do the assessment more than once fairly easily. You could do a pre and post testing. So there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah. I think the generalizability questions that we had earlier, I think of course that is much easier to kind of solve in a panel discussion. But then the other point is how applicable is it to these patients? Are these really the patients that will later get the treatment? Because I think that was quite interesting from your vignettes that you had a very specific target patient in mind. You didn't have a treatment naive first-time antipsychotic user in mind, but for this you would foresee that these treatment naive patients would always probably first get a oral medication, and mm-hmm. only if patients would be seen as needing something that is more adherent, mm-hmm. Then only they would get these long acting injectable things. I think there were strong reasons why patients would get assist, because they would be perceived to be less adherent. So for example, patients with strong substance abuse or something like this, these would probably also be other vignettes that you could use to show why it should be used in these patients. So I think, and discussing these vignettes up front, I think is also very, very interesting. Mm-hmm. Discussions maybe to have with regulators.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. We are nearly on the top of the hour. We'll close now the meeting. We have recorded it, and we'll see whether we put this recording on our homepage. Thanks a lot for Eva for giving the presentation today. One last note: if you want to see any further follow-up on this presentation today, please go to www.benefitriskassessment.com and subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll never miss something like this in the future.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Have a good time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.